My name is Gopal Mitra, and I work as a program specialist in the disability section, which is part of the program division at UNICEF headquarters in New York. When we talk about mine action, victim assistance, as we know, is one of the key pillars of mine action. And when we talk about victim assistance, we always talk about age and gender appropriate victim assistance. We know that children, our data, our evidence says that children run or have a high risk of being victims, and they are often the highest among survivors. Data from Afghanistan, from Somalia says as high as 42% of victims and survivors are children. Around us, that victim assistance programs rarely consciously take into account the specific needs and appropriateness of victim assistance for children. So we know children have a higher risk, but at the same time we know that programs around us often do not consciously include. As well as we know that if we don't consciously include or consider the needs or specific needs and the uniqueness of children, then you are more likely not to design something which is appropriate. All children who are affected by risk of landmines or the explosive remnants or war are victims. It's children, their families, the entire community who run the risk. Uh, when we talk about a survivor is a child in this instance who has suffered injuries and has survived the injuries from a landmine or explosive remnants of war. The Child Focused Victim Assistance Guidance, developed by UNICEF, was launched in 2016. Since it was developed in a very uh, participatory as well as a rigorous manner, which included mapping of existing laws, legislation, policies, programs, scoping of doing a thorough literature review. It included missions in the field wherein survivors and family members could give their views. It included a survey which was responded by experts in the area, practitioners in the area, and of course, it went through a thorough vetting. And not only that, the content in the guidelines of the guidelines will also help child protection in emergencies practitioners in general to design and implement policies and programs which actually lead to inclusion of children with disabilities and other victims and survivors, and overall to develop robust and strong child protection in emergency programs. The six pillars or critical components or victim assistance is first, collection of data and analysis of data. We know that if we want to systematically and effectively program or reach out to any population, we need to know what they are, how many. For example, if you're talking about victims, we are talking about survivors, if you're talking about children with disabilities, we need to know how many children with disabilities are there, where they are, and what is the situation. And it's based on this information that we'll be able to systematically plan any intervention, including victim assistance. The second pillar is emergency and continuing medical care. We know that because of the size of the bodies of children, the nature of medical care that they need is often different, and it has to be appropriate. I have seen in many instances that the surgery of an amputation, the type of surgery, and how to what with what precision it is done on a child greatly impacts the fitting of a prosthetic or an assistive device at a later stage. So because of their unique nature of the bodies of children and the impact of injuries. Both emergency and continuing medical care is important. The third is the issue of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation, I think, is one of the most visible components within victim assistance, and it includes important components like therapy, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, fitting of assistive devices, and so on. And it is not one time. So we have to ensure that how an effective ecosystem of rehabilitation is developed, and which will greatly impact victim assistance. The fourth is psychological and psychosocial support. We know about the stigma and discrimination that is attached to disability. Children with disabilities are often called names when they go to school. Often the physical trauma is overshadowed by psychological trauma that children and adults undergo after an injury. I can tell you from first-hand experience, because I myself became blind as a result of an explosion, an improvised explosive device 20 years back. And if I recollect, I think the psychological trauma that I went through at times overshadowed the physical loss of the eye and other injuries to my body. So psychosocial support is critical, and it has to be appropriately designed for children. The fifth is social and economic inclusion, and this is also critical. When we talk about inclusive education these days. Inclusive education is the foundation for an inclusive society. We know the sustainable development goal number 4 talks about inclusive quality education. So all these are important, and equally important is economic inclusion, and social and economic inclusion will determine how effectively a child or an adult will be able to participate in the society, which of course is our ultimate goal, effective participation. And the sixth pillar is legislations and policies. I don't need to, you are all well aware of the importance of policies and legislations. So a robust system of legislation and policies is important for victim assistance to be effective. The CRPD stands for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is one of the foundational international instruments on the subject. It was adopted by the General Assembly in 2006, and till date, more than 170 governments have ratified the convention. It has witnessed one of the speediest ratification amongst international treaties. So the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities essentially lays down uh, the ways in which uh, persons with disabilities experience discrimination, and how governments primarily can address the discrimination to ensure full participation of persons with disabilities. Talking about that, children with disabilities feature particularly is very visible within the convention. There is a specific article called Article 7, which talks about children with disabilities and their rights, and what states and governments need to do is spread across the 50 articles of the convention. Talking about the principles in a minute, a right to the right to dignity, right to non-discrimination, uh, uh, the right to accessibility. Accessibility is one of the key principles of the convention. Now, accessibility is both a means and an end. When we talk about accessibility, for example, we are talking about not only accessibility of the physical environment, which I'll come to later, but we are also talking about accessibility of information. For example, in this context, let me talk about mind risk education. Just to give an example, When we talk about mind risk education, are we thinking about how mind risk education can be accessible to a child who has difficulty in seeing, a child who is blind or visually impaired, a child who is deaf or has an intellectual disability? We know about examples and practices. For example, Handicap International, which is incidentally renamed as Humanity and Inclusion earlier this year, has developed very interesting simple methods. For example, through board games, how a child who is blind can understand or be taught about mind risk education. They have developed manuals for teachers, wherein teachers are given practical tips on how to adapt their mind risk education to make it accessible to children who are blind or deaf or have intellectual impairments. Also, things like videos. They have developed videos for children who are deaf, uh, uh, so that mind risk education can be accessed by them. So what I mean to say is, uh, we have to be accessible. We have to use an inclusion and accessibility lens in whatever we do. And the moment we use that lens, and if we use it, the lens of inclusion, when we design and develop our programs, it's not difficult and to for us to design programs which are by nature inclusive. And let me tell you, our experience and evidence shows that it costs very, very little extra. Apart from that, the CRPD principles also include evolving capacity of children. We know the concept. It also talks about taking or accepting disability as a part of human diversity, so that disability is not only looked as a defect or a deficiency, but just another a unique feature among human beings. We talk human beings are unique. So to accept or to see disability as a part of human diversity and not as a defect and deficiency, and that itself changes the lens through which we view the world around us and people, including persons with disabilities around us.